Let's talk about React Native, what React Native is and why we should use React Native. So React Native is a library developed by Facebook and maintained as well by Facebook, and it's a JavaScript library, and it gives you the power to write a single JavaScript code, and you can compile it for iOS and Android as well as for web. So the biggest reason you should be using React Native is that you're going to write a single code and you can build applications for different platforms. Now this is a huge advantage because prior to React Native, people used to write separate code for iOS and separate code for Android, right? And being an organization, you want application for both the platforms, right? And for that matter, you need application for the website also, right? So because of React Native, we now have the ability to write cross-platform, high performant and great UI applications, right? Now there are other alternatives to React Native, Flutter as well as Kotlin multi-platform, but I don't want to do any comparison. The reason you are here is because you want to learn React Native, and if I get into that debate that why React Native is the best, then it will keep on going on. It will keep going on, right? So without any further ado, let's do the bare minimum setup needed to start a React Native application, right? So if you open the official React Native website and if you go to environment setup, right? So this environment setup has changed. Now they have changed to something called as Expo, but I will not suggest that we should use Expo. The reason is, if you use with Expo, things will initially be very easy, and you will not understand the native part of React Native. And I think being a React Native developer, you should start with React Native rather than using Expo, right? So you can see that there is one option which we can select, get started without a framework, right? Now what do we need to do? First and the foremost thing, there are some common setups which we have to do. So what we'll say, we'll click here, set up your environment, and as you can see, we have now three different options. The options are on which machine you're gonna write your React Native code, and that will make a difference. So if you want to build your application for both Android and iOS, you have to use a Mac. If you're gonna use Windows, then you cannot build for iOS, and same is true for Linux. So it's a typical Apple ecosystem thing, that in order to build for iOS, you need a Mac OS. It's as simple as that. So since I'm using a Mac OS, so I'll just show that I'll show how to set up the environment for React Native on macOS, but the process more or less remains the same for Windows and Linux, right? And don't get disappointed if you don't have a Mac OS. It's just matter of learning things. Once you learn things on Windows, you will be able to run that code for Android, right? And eventually, whenever you get a Mac, right, or whenever you have your friend's Mac or your relative's Mac, you can just transfer your code and you can build it on iOS, right? So don't get disappointed. Let's get started. And the statement is not just true for React Native. If you want to build anything for iOS, right, or Mac OS, you need an Apple laptop. So it's a typical Apple ecosystem thing which cannot be dealt with, and that's what it is, right? So the first and the foremost thing is we need to do some kind of setup, right? So first of all, we have selected our OS as development OS as Mac OS. Now we have to select the target OS, right? So irrespective it's Android or iOS, there are some common setups which you have to do. So we will do that thing. So we need to install something called as Node. So Node is basically JavaScript runtime. Basically, it allows you to run JavaScript code in simple words, right? And what is Watchman? You also need to install Watchman. Watchman is basically a software which keeps a track of your files. So it will immediately get to know if something has changed or not. So what is the advantage of using Watchman is that whenever you write code, so if you make the change, let's say you are showing some name on the mobile application and you change that name, and if you save the file, immediately that thing will get updated, right? So that's basically called as hot reload. So once you do the installation of Node and Watchman, and if you go to a terminal and if you do node -v, you should be able to see a version of Node. This signifies that okay, Node is installed, and same is true for Watchman. If you do Watchman -v, you'll be able to see the version of Watchman, right? Okay, now coming back, to the platform specific setups, right? So let's start with Android. For Android, what you need Java, right? So in order to install Java, you can just run these two commands, and once you run these two commands, you should run this command cat, and then you should say zshrc, and if you open this, you should see export Java home should be present. It has to be present. If your installation of Java is done correctly, it will be present. If it's not done, then you need to debug that, okay, what went wrong while installing Java. So whenever Java gets installed nicely, properly, you will be able to see this thing, as well as you can run Java minus minus version, and you should be able to see a version of Java, right? So the same version it's getting printed here, which is present in the .zshrc, right? Okay, now coming back, once we have the Java installed, we need a software called as Android Studio. So you can just click on this link and Android Studio will open, and from there you can download the Android Studio. It's a pretty straightforward process, and when you are downloading, you have to make sure that whenever you're gonna install, right, these three things are checked, right? So you'll get the check boxes and you should click on all of these three and then proceed with the installation. Now once your installation finishes, you should again go to that zshrc and you should check if these three lines are present or not. If these three lines are present, well and good. If they are not present, you should add them. So if you do all these things properly, your Android setup is done and you are good to go with the Android, right? Now if you open, and once you're done with the Android Studio setup, what you can do is you can also set up a simulator or emulator. In the case of Android, simulator is an iOS thing and emulator is an Android thing, but they both are same, right? Running some virtual device on your computer, right? So if you click on more action, you can create virtual devices. So if you click on this plus button, you can click bunch of predefined devices. If you do next, you should be able to see, okay, which Android version you want to install, and then you can also create a hardware profile, right? So since I have already set up a bunch of emulators and things are running well and good, so I will not create one more emulator. Right now, let's jump into the iOS specific setup, right? So in order to do the iOS specific setups, again, the installation of Node and Watchman are mandatory things. You need them, right? The next thing is having an Xcode. So you should install the Xcode. It's a software, and when you install Xcode, you should follow these instructions. Once you follow these instructions, you have to come to something called as location, and in location you have to ensure that the Xcode, whatever version you have, is selected, right? This is a must, and this step is given very straightforward, right? Nothing specific to be done. Now what you also need to do is you need to set up some simulators. So again, the steps are pretty straightforward. For iOS, we also need to do one more installation, that is we have to install cocoapods. So if you click on this URL, you should come to this page and you should see how to install cocoapods, right? So this is also one of the mandatory steps. Now bunch of possible issues can happen when setting up React Native environment for iOS, and one of those issues is associated with something called as Ruby version mismatch. So let's not get into what is Ruby. Just consider Ruby as so we all know Ruby on Rails is a programming language, so we need Ruby in order to build applications for iOS, right? So what we can do is, if you run Ruby -v, you should see that some version of Ruby is present, right? And usually when you are setting up your React Native project for iOS, so if the Ruby is not installed properly, it will directly specify that there's a Ruby error or there's a Ruby mismatch, right, in the version. So in order to overcome, what you can do is you can search RVM, which is Ruby version manager, and you can install RVM. Once you install RVM, you can perform bunch of commands like RVM use 2.7.0, and if you do that, it says that this version doesn't exist, so you can run the command rvm install ruby this, right? So I'm not going to do that. What I'm trying to say is that if you get Ruby specific errors, and especially things like okay, you have this version of Ruby, but the required version is this. So you can install RVM first. Once you install RVM, which is nothing but Ruby version manager, then you can use this command RVM use, and the version which is specified in the error, that is the needed version. And there are other debugging steps which you may or may not need. So we'll be discussing all those things, but I think if you follow the React Native official document properly, the setup will be done right. And without any further ado, please get your systems up and running, and we are going to start to code from the very next video, right? Thank you guys.